Hello. Thank you, Patrick. Thanks again to the State Library for having us. Thank you all for coming on a pretty miserable day. I was, kind of tossing up when I saw the forecast this morning, so good on you all for coming in. Just want to repeat as well that acknowledgement that we're here on Kaurna country, and of course this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Thank you again, Patrick, for that introduction. My name is Walter. I'm a journalist and a historian based here in Adelaide, but I think the most important thing you guys need to know about me is that I'm a guy who really likes going to the library. So it's great to be back here. I've been coming to this particular library for a long time. I think I was a student doing history at the University of Adelaide down the road when I first really got a taste of the depth of the collections and the archives that are here in this place. And they captured my imagination then and ever since, really. And were played a huge role in what became my first book, Young Rupert, The Making of the Murdoch Empire. If you were lucky enough to come along to the talk I did a couple of years ago in this very lecture theatre, we really got stuck into how all these different archives that have been sitting in the State Library allowed me to piece together, kind of scene by scene, year by year, what it was like to live and be in these newsrooms and these sometimes courtrooms in 1950s Adelaide. And that was all thanks to the State Library of South Australia's collection. Who wouldn't want to go back in time to 1950s Adelaide, the old Adelaide airport, back when afternoon newspapers were still a thing, a little bit more inconvenient than the iPhone in the pocket. It's quite a bulgy number. But that's our young Rupert and his editor, Rowan Rivette. And this latest book as well has drawn significantly from the State Library's reference collection in particular. I was working at the South Australian Museum next door when I first started thinking about this story, and being the cool guy that I am, I would spend my lunch breaks very often ducking next door to read memoirs by entomologists and various other things that I've requested up out of storage. Obviously, I don't want to have lunch with my colleagues. I'm going to the library. And Patrick and the team at the State Library have very kindly brought up a few of these very rare books that I consulted whilst working on this story. And I should also add that this book I was able to work on once I left the museum pretty substantially in 2020, whichever year it was that I did that, thanks to a South Australian Literary Fellowship, which was supported by the State Library and Writers SA. So, this book is all about museums, and as we said, Australia's greatest museum heist. There are a few different heists that vie for that title, but given this was a serial heist targeting 3 different museums, I think this one takes the cake. And there's also a certain stylistic, there's a level of panache associated with this butterfly heist that I think sets it above all the other ones. As I said before, the first book was about the Murdochs. This book pivots away and takes a look at this world of museums alongside my media career, which, if you are familiar with the media landscape today, has been, it's pretty up and down. I've been made redundant and unemployed, and the publications I work for vanish from underneath me a little bit too regularly for my liking. But when that happens, I retreat to the safe and warm embrace of the historical and cultural sector. So I've famously a much more stable occupation. So I've worked in a lot of museums and cultural institutions over the years, and I've always been fascinated by the ways that these places look after and share our history and our culture. A place like the South Australian Museum next door, you walk through these spaces, many of us would have been taken there by, as children, by our parents or our grandparents. Maybe some of you have taken your own children, your grandchildren, maybe great-grandchildren, and in these places we come up and see, these histories, natural history, science. It's our first taste of these things, right up there behind the glass, as if we could reach out and touch it. If it wasn't for the glass and the security people and the cameras and all the signs telling you not to touch everything. And then there's all the stuff you don't see out on the gallery floor, all the really good stuff that's sitting behind closed doors, out the back in the science centre, these collections which, these museums are collecting institutions, and they sit on millions of objects that have been collected by hundreds, if not thousands of people over sometimes centuries. And they form a really important historical purpose, a really important cultural purpose and scientific purpose. And none of us really understand that. A lot of people, it's quite opaque for people outside of that museum system. So I've always been fascinated by these places and the ways that these collections aren't just, the repositories of history, but these museums and these cultural institutions, they're also the products of history themselves, and often entwined in their stories and their collections are complicated and sometimes dark legacies that I've always found really fascinating. And so I took this job at the South Australian Museum, not really sure how I'd possibly bring any of those quite big stories together in one project or one story. And while I waited for the Young Rupert book to come out, I just thought, I just keep my head down and chip away at this sort of day job. And then in week one, a colleague at the museum took me aside and said, have you heard this story about this English gentleman collector adventurer who sailed into Sydney Harbour one day, spent the next few years going up and down the coast of this country, this continent, dropped the remote, and sort of went wherever he wanted, went where he pleased, took what he liked, and then went back to England with everything. And for me, just the beats of that story felt like they sort of tilted at a bigger history and might be a way to give a narrative sort of spine, I guess, to that bigger, more complicated history. And so I really couldn't resist. And so when I finished up at the museum, I jumped straight into it and explored this story, which is, as I said, it's a way to, I guess, open up the world of museums and these collections that we don't see and kind of unpack for people the value of these collections. Because, when we talk about, the Mona Lisa or a vault of gold, when someone breaks into those, we understand the value. But when it's a whole lot of insects sitting in the back rooms of a museum for decades, if not centuries, the value is a bit more opaque. But this was a way to explore the value of these collections, but also the cost. So here we are, jumping into this book. I'm going to start by reading a section from the prologue. I should say as well, in a very cynical way, it also was an opportunity to lean into the true crime tropes that are so popular these days in this era of mushroom murder podcasts. So when I read this passage, if you can imagine the Law and Order dun-dun sound effects to punctuate the storytelling that will only enrich your inner experience of it. So this is prologue, The Fake. The butterfly was already dead when the old man found it, lying in the snow 5,200 feet above sea level. It didn't have a name then, as he bent down and scooped its lifeless body from the ice, a tiny John Doe, light as a feather, barely visible to an untrained eye. But this encounter, in the spring of 1922, wasn't his first brush with the short life cycle of an insect. It wasn't his first time on Barrington Tops either, a volcanic plateau perched high up in the Great Dividing Range of New South Wales. The man's name was Johnny Hobson, but to many, he was known as the father of the tops. This weathered 55-year-old with a salt and pepper goatee knew every ridge, gully and track of this land of the mist. And that is him, second from left, in the white shirt and vest and horse and cart. It was no secret that the tops were good butterfly country. If you picked your moment right, the mountain air would be thick with them, gathering at dusk in cloud-like clusters, ripe for someone like Hobson to catch hundreds at a time with a sweep of their net, or simply pluck them from a bush with their fingers. And there's a footnote on this page, and the reference is that book with the question mark. What butterfly is that? By Gustavus Athol Waterhouse. Or in this case, a cold snap or unexpected snowfall might leave the white ground littered with delicate corpses waiting in plain sight for a keen-eyed collector. And the butterflies were just the start of its riches. And once word began to spread of this nature's wonderland, those collectors swarmed like moths to a flame. Hobson was there to guide the first scientific expedition in 1915, and then the successive waves of genteel academics, wet-eared university students, and avid amateurs who trudged up its misty slopes with their nets and their killing jars. In December 1921, he rode up alongside Alec Burns, and that is Alec Burns on the far left with his swag and his horse. A blue-eyed boy from Melbourne who posed for this horseback happy snap along the way with Hobson and 3 other collectors. Burns was back again in January 1922, this time with the famous Athol Waterhouse, author of said book, Which Butterfly Is That?, who was at the time one of Australia's most famous and prolific entomologists. As we can see, he literally wrote the book on Australian butterflies. Sometimes Hobson collected evidence, like a half-buried stone axe head, that suggested this wasn't his land at all, that Barrington Tops had a deeper history, that for countless generations this was a place of sanctuary and ceremony for the Gringai people and their neighbours, where the butterflies and birds offered a way to read the seasons and find water and sweet nectar. On one expedition, Hobson reflected that on every trip he had a crank or two in the party. There was the butterfly crank and the native relic crank. And then, one day, in June 1928, Johnny Hobson himself killed over, dead, at the age of 60. But the story of his butterfly didn't end there. Most of the 3,000 insects he'd collected were bequeathed to the Australian Museum in Sydney, but that little fellow from the snowfield had already passed into the hands and collection of Athol Waterhouse. Now, finishing the work of other collectors, whether they were living or dead, friend or stranger, was nothing new for Waterhouse. There he is. He soon set about identifying the body, and he's looked closer at its wings. He saw orange-red markings on the brown wings, markings that told him that this was something different. This was something new. Hobson's butterfly would become a holotype, the first specimen of a species or subspecies to be documented by science, to be held for posterity as an essential reference point for future study. Later generations of entomologists would give it a much cooler nickname, the flame hair streak, but in 1928, Waterhouse dubbed it Pseudomenus clorinda barringtonensis. And that is it on the cover of the book. But is it? We'll find out. Later, Waterhouse donated his collection to the Australian Museum in Sydney, and there, amongst the endless rows and drawers of Australia's first and oldest natural history museum, it would be preserved and protected long after he followed Johnny Hobson and their butterflies off the mortal coil. At least, that was the plan. Then one day, in 2016, an email pinged into the inbox of Dr. Michael F. Braby, dun dun, with an attachment. An unexpected attachment. Now, some background on Michael Braby. He's a scientist at the Australian National University, and if Waterhouse wrote the book on butterflies that you'd find in a library or a bookshelf in the 1920s and the 1930s, if you go into a bookshop today or a library, our guy Michael Braby has probably written that book. And attached to that email was a photograph of a butterfly. Not just any butterfly. This was supposed to be that holotype, Pseudomenus clorinda barringtonensis, the same one that Hobson had retrieved from the snow over 90 years earlier. Collections are on a different trajectory to human life, Braby once told me. Human life might be 70 or 80 years, but a collection will last hundreds and hundreds of years. So you have to take a very long view. They really underpin our knowledge of biodiversity. They are the foundations, the pillars, if you like. So once you start compromising that, yeah, it's not good. And Braby zoomed in on his computer screen, but he grew increasingly puzzled. The label was correct, but there was something off about the markings that put the flame in flame hair streak. To Braby, it seemed like those telltale streaks had been set out, not by millions of years of evolution and adaptation, but by a very thin paintbrush. I realised that there was something wrong with the specimen, Braby told me. It had been touched up. I'd never come across that before. Not a good day in the office for Michael Braby. So that's a point of discovery. There are a lot of great points of discovery throughout this story, and I'm going to dive into the main narrative now with another one. So we're in the State Library of South Australia today, but this story really kicks off in January 1947 at a building that is now home to the State Library of Victoria. But did anyone here visit back when it was also the home of the National Museum of Victoria? So here we are, it's between Swanston and Russell Street. This is currently a nice reading room, but as you can see, in those days it was just the classic archetypal 19th, 20th century natural history museum, piled to the ceiling with dead and stuffed animals. A visiting American museum expert in the 1930s said that it was like a morgue, which was not particularly nice for him to say, but also probably not unfair. And so our story starts here at the National Museum, and one day in January 1947, when an entomologist at the museum turns up for his first day of work for the new year. His name is Alec Burns, and we might remember him from his trip with Johnny Hobson, back when he was a much younger man. Well, he's not anymore. He's a middle-aged scientist. He's been all around the world, and he now has the plum job of curator of entomology at the National Museum of Victoria. And this was the same museum that he used to come in to as a boy and really sparked his imagination and his passion for insect collecting. And now he's got the top job. He's in the hot seat. He's the caretaker for this huge collection that he's inherited. And he goes down into the basement, this sort of labyrinth, this dungeon of a basement, and he opens a drawer. And whose drawers were they? Well, back in 1946, the museum upstairs with all the stuffed animals, they'd started displaying the collection of a guy named George Lyell, an amateur collector who, like Burns, had got hooked on collecting as a young man, and over the next 50 years gathered over 50,000 butterflies and moths. His best friend was our pal, Gustavus Athol Waterhouse, and that lovely book up the back, the maroon-covered one, The Butterflies of Australia, they actually co-wrote that one together. And like Athol Waterhouse, Lyell decided to donate his collection to his local museum before he died, and he spent years, well over a decade, basically resorting the museum's entire collection around his own. And this collection was so big that the museum could only display a few dozen cases at a time upstairs. So every few weeks, they would go up and rotate a few in and take a few out. And that's what Alec Burns was doing on this morning in January when he opens a drawer of gold and green birdwing butterflies. And this is all perfectly routine. This is normal entomologist stuff until he notices some gaps. So this is George Lyell before we go any further. That handsome guy, 1895. He's waiting for the photo to be finished so he can go back out with his net. But here are the gaps in the drawer. And at first, that's not necessarily anything to worry about. George Lyell, he was a pretty methodical guy, and when you're building a collection, you want to add to it over time, so maybe you leave a few gaps to fill in later on. But then Alec Burns opens another drawer, and another drawer, and another drawer, and he keeps encountering gaps. And finally, he opens one that he is pretty sure is chock full of bright blue Ulysses butterflies. But it's not full, is it? It's got gaps as well, and pretty soon he realises that hundreds are missing from the National Museum's collection. And he makes what I can only imagine was a very painful call. He brings in none other than George Lyell, who, at this point, is a much grumpier looking fellow. And that's not a generalisation. I've read some letters in the National Museum of the Melbourne Museum's archives in which George is very grumpily expressing his views to the long-suffering staff of that institution. And so he comes in and he's got a list of his own and he's got a little red pencil and he does a count. And pretty soon he comes up with another number, over 800 missing butterflies. Yeah, I love it when people gasp when I announce the number. And the nature of the gaps, as we've seen, there's a few missing gaps from each drawer. Someone's really gone through and picked the eyes out of it. This is a very methodical, very careful theft. It's not like someone has, taken an opportunistic smash and grab. They haven't just opened a drawer and emptied it in a sack and gone on their way. Someone who obviously knew their way around an entomological collection, knew their way around a museum, has used that knowledge, used that access to commit what is this incredibly transgressive act. And because of that, they realise we might not be the only ones. So that's just the start. And they start ringing around to museums in Adelaide and Sydney. And I want to give a quick introduction to Nancy Adams, partly because, as you've seen, this story and world is a very patriarchal one, full of men, a lot of grey beards, a lot of moustaches, but there are a few women, and one of them is Nancy here, and she is, I think, plays a really important role, not only for this story, but just the museum in general, the Australian Museum in Sydney. She was an assistant in the entomology department, a very talented woman. She scored a job as a cadet straight out of high school, continued to study on the side, became an accomplished artist, and while male cadets could often aspire to climb the ladder from the bottom rung to the very top, at this point, Herbert Hale was the head of the South Australian Museum. He'd actually started as a cadet. But Nancy was very much kept under a glass ceiling, and she stayed at cadet classification and pay, which kind of sucks, for something like 20 years, even as she took on all the work of registering, processing and pinning the lion's share of insects that came into their care. And she also worked on exhibits, and she illustrated scientific journal articles by a lot of her male peers. And when Athol Waterhouse started bringing in his collection over to the museum in the 1930s, it was Nancy Adams who he worked most closely with. And I think it's fair to say that she probably knew his collection better than anyone else at the museum. And so when this call comes in, her boss, Anthony Musgrave, he's not in the office. His out of office is on. He is off on a field trip at Barrington Tops, no less. And so the job falls to Nancy Adams, who very quickly identifies some missing specimens in Sydney and begins a full audit. And that comes out to 1,600 missing butterflies. And when you combine that with the 500 or so missing from the South Australian Museum, that's around 3,000 rogue butterflies. And let me tell you a story about the South Australian Museum. Their archives, their paper trail, the South Australian leg of this investigation, as a South Australian myself, pretty bad. Not helpful when you're trying to solve a crime in 1947, not helpful when you're trying to piece it together in 2023 and 24. And they still, to this day, aren't really sure how those butterflies went missing, but they've managed to pinpoint it, they think, to a moment in January 1946, so a year before Alec Burns makes his discovery, when one Saturday evening, someone walking down North Terrace notices that the front doors of the South Australian Museum are wide open, which is not their usual setting for late on a weekend. And the alarm system that they had, with over 100 contact points throughout the building, didn't work. Very often didn't work. The night watchman, deaf. Not helpful in this scenario. It's a great report. I very recommend reading it in the South Australian Museum archives if you ever get the chance. And so they come to the generous conclusion that perhaps a patron got stuck, because it was a bit of a labyrinth there at the time. Got stuck in the toilets or something. They stayed behind closing time, had a little panic, broke open the locked doors, the Yale locked doors, and ran off into the night, as I'm sure would be our natural reaction as well. And they undertook a quick check of the museum's various collections. Herbert Hale later concedes in these letters back and forth in January 1947 that it must have been a rather cursory check, because they are missing, as I said, several hundred butterflies. And they think it must have happened then. And so the list of suspects, not in Adelaide, but in Melbourne and Sydney, was very short. And Nancy herself offers a name very quickly. And in Melbourne, they also produce and independently corroborate the same name. Alec Burns had actually gone out on a collecting trip to New South Wales with this man just a few weeks before discovering the missing butterflies. And this guy had actually left that trip early. He'd gone back to his home in Sydney, but apparently was seen back in Melbourne hanging around the museum around closing time. And in the archives of the Melbourne Museum, while piecing together this story, I found one incredible handwritten note from apparently the then treasurer of the National Museum of Victoria, had actually poked his head into the underground entomologist's room at around this time, that same room where the butterflies were later found to be missing, and he walked in on this stranger, a man he didn't know, who, by the sounds of it, was basically up to his elbows in butterflies. But he didn't raise the alarm. He didn't really ask that many questions about who this guy was. Partly because, well, one, he seemed to know a lot about insects, but also he was very obliging and spoke with, and this is a direct quote, spoke well and with a rather cultured accent. So obviously there's nothing to see here. So let's meet this stranger, Colin William Ford Wyatt, born in London in 1909 into this family who in earlier centuries had been famous as this sort of architectural dynasty, fated by British royalty and the rich. Actually, you can read more about this architectural dynasty in another book from the South Australian Library's reference library, Wyatt's, An Architectural Dynasty. Very helpful. And in that book, it's said that the rise and fall of the family's fortunes pretty much mirrored the rise and decline of the British Empire itself. And Colin is once described in a newspaper report as the prototype of the Cambridge-educated, be-moustached Englishman, one is sure to meet at the North Pole, in a cannibal village, or at a ritzy hotel in St. Moritz. And as we can see here, he's just a real Renaissance man. He's a naturalist, he's a mountaineer, a former champion skier, an accordion-playing folk singer, a writer, an accomplished artist, and of course, a very keen butterfly collector. And most people he meets are just struck by his incredible talent, his charisma, his style. There are all these references to his outfits wherever he goes. He's got this quilted Swiss jacket that crops up in at least 2 newspaper articles. He's got this great blue jumper. And wherever he goes, he spins these extraordinary tales. Tales of the mountains he's climbed, the people he's met, and the butterflies he's collected. And he's once described as this unusual bird of passage, a sensational character who makes it into the papers in pretty much every country and town that he visits. And going backwards a little bit, Colin's father was already himself a very accomplished mountaineer, skier, and perhaps most importantly, a butterfly collector. And James Wyatt, his father, did really everything he could to mould Colin into this consummate naturalist, athlete, and collector from a very young age. Colin was around 6 years old when his father first showed him how to collect and pin his own butterflies. And this is a detail that later comes up in court. But I think it's also important to note, and this is something that Colin himself raises in the opening pages of his first book, The Call of the Mountains, which you can see there, also in the State Library's collection. He was raised on the stories of his father's own adventures across 19th century Europe and even Australia, and this brought a sense of a golden age of mountaineering, of adventure, exploration and discovery. And I think it's pretty clear that this planted a seed for the kind of man Colin would try to become and the life he tried to lead. And by the time Colin hits Cambridge, as we can see, all his father's efforts have paid off. He's emerged into adulthood as this dashing champion skier. He's barely out of his teens when he starts making international headlines at ski meets around Europe. They call him a star of great magnitude, a magnificent figure who performs amazing feats. And back in the city, he's regularly spotted in his tuxedo, rolling with the young, rich and famous of London society. And there's some, if you have access to the Tatler online archive, there are some great photos there as well. This is a postcard that I didn't get from a library collection. I bought it on eBay, but it's signed, and that's in the Walter Marsh collection. And so as we can see, Colin has this hunger for adventure, the kind of hunger his father's generation enjoyed, but it's the 1930s, and it's pretty clear continental Europe isn't going to give that to him, partly because the Alps, since his father's heyday, have been turned into tourist hotspots, but also the looming threat of this thing called the Second World War. There is a vibe shift taking place in Europe at this time. So he takes up an offer to come to New Zealand to show them how to build up their own ski tourism industry. And he pretty much immediately starts breaking ski records and trying to climb as many mountains as humanly possible. This is the photo that appeared in the Timaru Herald when he first sailed into New Zealand, a very striking character with a very nice jacket. And then eventually he returns. Actually, going back to the 1936 trip, he also spends time in Australia and takes part in a 6-week tour for the ABC, playing accordion and performing yodeling folk songs in 6 different cities around the country. And that is a great file that exists in the National Archives if you ever feel like looking that one up. And he eventually returns to Australia in 1939, the day after World War II is declared. And he didn't come alone. This time he had a wife, Mary, who was the daughter of a British Army colonel. She's barely hit her 20s when they get engaged and very quickly uproots her life to join him in Australia. And she quickly becomes known as the pretty wife, and that's a quote from a newspaper, the pretty wife of this famous Cambridge skier, and they soon become part of Sydney society. As you can see, she's cropping up in the social pages within days of arrival. And Colin, as soon as he steps off the boat, he starts looking for work. He gets a job in the census office, being a war, and later does voiceovers for the Department of Information, and also becomes a camouflage officer alongside the likes of Max Dupain and various other artists. We don't have it here today, but there's a whole book on the camouflage movement in the reference library. Check it out. It is so weird. It is so fascinating. It turns out, not all that useful to the war effort, but they had an incredible time doing it. And he also tries to make inroads into Australia's growing modern art scene. And he actually manages to get a few pieces into an exhibition by the Contemporary Art Society in Sydney, alongside people like Dorrit Black and Sidney Nolan. And he also gets mocked in the newspapers, singled out alongside Nolan for his attempts at surrealism. But to be fair, the Australian media at that point didn't want a bar of any of the surrealists, so he was in good company there. And here we have a clipping from his first Australian solo exhibition. It's not his most surreal period, it must be said. This is in his Alpine village kind of era. And it isn't just artists and wartime camoufleurs that he starts making friends with. Not long after he arrives in Australia, he starts reaching out to butterfly collectors. Sorry, firstly, these are some great images that are not in the book. I only found them after it went to print. And I think this illustrates two big sides of him. This is on a ski trip to Kosciuszko in the 1940s, and he's very much often up a tree looking at something, or he's absolutely the life of the party with his accordion back at the chalet. And I should point out, he's kind of sprained or dislocated his arm at this point. In both of these photos, there's a sling, and that's how committed he is to just having a great time. He's still going. And so he doesn't just play accordion at chalets, he goes and befriends entomologists. And one of them we've met before, Gustavus Athol Waterhouse. And so they go out on a few collecting trips together, and soon Wyatt has a letter of introduction from Waterhouse himself that he uses to introduce himself to the staff of museums and institutions around the country. And they pretty much let him in, because that's how these institutions worked in those days. Collectors and amateur scientists were given extraordinary access to these museum collections to study, to compare specimens, to do research. And it was all done in the hope that one day, like Waterhouse, like Lyell, like Hobson, that they would one day donate their own collections to the museum. And that's kind of the whole point of this system. This sort of noble idea that the museum collections, as Braby was saying, they outlive any one person, any one collector, and they create this greater body of knowledge. But at the same time, it also makes it kind of like a big honour system, built on this collective spirit of collectors. And what could go wrong there? So we're jumping ahead back to January 1947. By the time they realise the butterflies are missing, and this man, Colin Wyatt, was probably the culprit, he's actually packed up his life in Australia, and he's made his way back to England, including several cases of scientific specimens that he's sent back via ship. And he's not keeping a low profile about this. This is a very handsome 3-page spread in Pix magazine announcing his imminent return to England. Artist on top of the world. There's a real kind of nothing to see sort of tone here. Just remember how kind of ebullient and upbeat his frame of mind seems to be in this article. It will be an important plot point later that I will be quizzing you on. And so they all know he's gone back to England at this point. So the Australian museums have to make another call. They call a fellow who spent a lot of time in Australia, was a scientist, a naturalist, did some time at the Waite Institute here in Adelaide for a while, bounced around Canberra, all these other places. Later wrote a very helpful memoir. This is a running theme in this presentation. Insect Delight by Dr. John Evans, very useful source. And so they know he's over at the Natural History Museum of London, and they give him a call. And John Evans becomes sort of the man on the ground in the English leg of this adventure. And that's where this case gets even more bizarre, because John Evans already knows the name Colin Wyatt. He actually went out to dinner with him in Tasmania when Colin was still in Australia. And he's not the only one at the museum in London that knows that name. He's very familiar to the staff there because he has in fact been banned from the Natural History Museum of London. It turns out a few years earlier, in 1942, Athol Waterhouse, Wyatt's one-time friend, he had started to suspect that maybe his new pal wasn't everything he was cracked up to be. Maybe his stories didn't add up. Maybe he wasn't a true scientist. And so he wrote a letter to a friend who worked at the London Museum. That friend, incidentally, was the dad of John Evans, a retired brigadier. We'll refer to him as the Brigadier from here on in. So he writes to his friend, the Brigadier, and he just very deliberately, very casually drops Colin Wyatt's name just to see if it gets a response. He gets a response. Almost immediately, he gets a telegram from the head entomologist at the Natural History Museum that reads, "Do not trust landscape painter." He then sends a letter telling Waterhouse that this man has collector's mania and is not to be trusted with specimens. Now, at this stage, Australian security services, by the time they get a note from Waterhouse saying he's received this quite alarming telegram, they've already got a dossier on this guy, Colin Wyatt. They've been trying to get their heads around this guy since almost as soon as he arrived in Sydney in 1939, on the eve of war, speaking all these languages, having spent so much time in Europe, and also having access to potentially sensitive information with all his work that he was doing during the war. He also owned a cape, but I don't think they really bundled that in with it. But it's just, just painting a rich picture of his time in Sydney. So they'd spent a bit of time investigating, but none of it really came to anything. They actually interviewed one of Colin's former colleagues from his brief stint as an ABC yodeler in residence. And this colleague said, quite unflatteringly, even if Wyatt were given the most confidential and secret information, he would have neither the grit nor the brains to really do anything with it, which in some ways is a nice thing to say, but in others is quite devastating. So they're all waiting to hear what's in this letter that Waterhouse is expecting from London. And when it does eventually arrive, it tells this story of how, over a decade later, back when Colin was this sort of high-flying Cambridge skiing ace, he was suspected of stealing over 200 rare butterflies from the basement of the London Natural History Museum. Now, at the time, when they noticed these butterflies were missing, the police were contacted. They floated Colin's name as a potential suspect, and a retired brigadier, I should say a different brigadier, there's a lot of brigadiers floating around at this time, he comes in, he's a friend of Colin's father, and he sort of tries to smooth it all over, and eventually Colin himself comes in. He continues to deny any knowledge, any involvement, but is essentially sort of put on the spot by this head entomologist, and he's told that as long as the butterflies are returned in good condition, they probably wouldn't take any further action. And surely enough, the very next day, the butterflies were returned to the museum on a Sunday, anonymously, and they didn't pursue it any further. But I guess clearly spread the word inside the museum to not leave that guy alone with any butterflies. And so over in Sydney, over a decade later, when Waterhouse gets this letter, he makes what would prove to be a huge mistake. He keeps it to himself. He doesn't send it to the security services. He tells them he thinks it's too libelous to share. But I think, on some level, Waterhouse, if you read his books and you read his letters, he and Lyell spent 50 years with this sort of collaboration, this relationship. But George was in Victoria, Athol was in Sydney, so they did it all by letter. You can really get a sense that there's a real paper trail for these two men and the kind of people they were. And I really think Waterhouse was just such a perfectionist that he didn't trust anyone else at the Sydney Museum to really keep an eye on this Colin Wyatt guy. And so sort of thought he'd keep tabs on this guy, Colin. He'd keep tabs on his own collection and make sure nothing went wrong. But unfortunately, quite tragically, Waterhouse has a stroke not long after, which leaves him bedbound and partly paralysed in his right arm. And there's this one letter he sends to Lyell where he says he can't even pin butterflies anymore, which for Waterhouse is a pretty tragic thing to read. And so this letter stays in amongst his papers in his desk somewhere for the next couple of years, even as Waterhouse's own name is being dropped by Wyatt to get access to these museum collections, to Waterhouse's own collection. I should say I didn't make any of this up. This is all sitting in different archives around museums and collections around Australia and in the UK as well. And as a researcher, my first book was about Rupert Murdoch, there's a lot of books about Rupert Murdoch. Pretty much 2 months after I'd published my book, there was another book about Rupert Murdoch. But this was an opportunity to really bring together, even though these books existed, to bring together primary sources, secondary sources, and knit together this narrative and kind of write the first draft of this history in a way that I found, incredibly thrilling and occasionally incredibly frustrating. So back to January 1947, on the 30th, right at the end of the month, just a few weeks after those butterflies are discovered missing, a detective from Scotland Yard and that entomologist, the head entomologist from the Natural History Museum in London, the same one that had rumbled Colin back in 1930 and tried to warn Waterhouse in 1942, they set out for Colin's mother's house in Surrey, where Colin has been bunkering down while everyone's snowed in this very bitter English winter. And Colin answers the door, and initially he tries to play it cool. He tries to deny any knowledge, but they've got a list of missing butterflies from Melbourne, and pretty soon he caves. And so I should share with you as well. This is that letter from the security services, but they are very confused and upset. And if you remember the tenor of that Pix magazine clipping, artist on top of the world, he's taken a different tact at this exchange. He eventually caves and he tells them that it was all because of the breakup of his marriage to Mary in 1946. He says, "I was driven to distraction over this matter, so I threw myself into my only hobby, namely entomology." I mean, leaving aside that he has many hobbies, it was a pretty extraordinary statement. And he tells them that to console himself, he would basically go into these museums and he would slip the specimens into small jars, open-topped, that he hid in his jacket pockets. And this is pretty extraordinary because that's pretty much all we ever learn technically about how he pulled off this heist. But it really just raises even more questions because I've been to a lot of these museums and I've seen these butterflies that, he stole, that have been recovered, spoiler alert. And some of them are huge, some of them are the size of your hand, some of them are tiny and delicate. The idea that he could somehow manage to whisk away a few hundred, a few thousand, it would have taken him so many trips. To do that without raising any suspicion at some point raises more questions about the museums themselves. And I think that's partly why at some point they stopped asking questions. But he somehow pulled it off and he agrees to cooperate and he eventually surrenders thousands of butterflies to the entomologist from the London Museum and the police. And back at the museum, John Evans, the brigadier, and their mates, they spend weeks trying to build a case against Wyatt, trying to convince not only the police, but the prosecutors, the whole British legal system. They're trying to school them on the basic tenets of entomology, of taxonomy, and explain that all those labels that are pinned to specimens, they're basically like little alibis, and they can be used to prove that the butterflies are stolen, or at the very least that Wyatt himself couldn't possibly have collected them. But this is made more complicated because Wyatt had apparently spent his nights in Australia and those snowy weeks at his mother's house in England changing the labels, cutting them up, replacing them with his own name or the names of his friends to make it seem like he had legitimately collected them. And this is pretty extraordinary, especially in some cases where, it would be a butterfly from this remote place in Arnhem Land and the only, white guy with a butterfly net who'd gone up there was Norman Tyndale from the museum next door. And he's CC'd in on this letter train. And they know that that's almost certainly his butterfly that he collected that has gone missing. And it only infuriates these scientists further because, as we heard earlier, those labels, that data, that's almost as important as the specimen itself. It's kind of the whole point of the collection. And so, remember how happy and upbeat he was in his last appearance in the news media? Well, things have taken a turn. When the case hits the West Ham Magistrates Court months later, the prosecutor gets up, and just to set the scene, John Evans, the brigadier, they got up really early. They've been preparing for this day. They've got cases of butterflies that they've prepared, a sort of sample set, and they've come in and they've laid them out on the solicitor's table, ready to be called up to explain just how important butterflies were and all this stuff about taxonomy and entomology. Those cases are not touched for the duration of what follows, because almost immediately the prosecutor gets up and has the charges downgraded to possessing stolen goods. It was as if Colin just happened to have them, to say nothing of this serial heist and international getaway that brought them all the way to England. And he pleads guilty to this lesser charge, and the prosecutor barely puts up a fight as Colin's lawyer spins this tale of a delicate only child, a shy, self-centred, aloof, lonely little boy whose divorce in Australia had prompted him to revert to this old hobby, this old source of comfort from his childhood, pitting butterflies with his father. Now, this didn't take into account the fact that the thefts must have occurred over a year and were clearly premeditated and very calmly carried out over many, many months, let alone the fact that, unbeknownst to all the people in Australia, it followed a similar case over a decade earlier. So there's a real pattern of behaviour. But the judge decides that Colin took the butterflies due to the psychological pressures of his divorce. He doesn't call any expert witnesses, no doctors, no psychiatrists, but he says, "I think you were suffering from distraction of the mind, which caused you to do something you would not have done in your ordinary senses," which, he said, was out of step with Colin's ordinarily admirable character, and he fines him £100. The butterflies are sent back to Adelaide, to the South Australian Museum, where the entomologists from Sydney and Melbourne, they all descend along with Norman Tyndale, that's him there with the magnifying glass. They all try and make sense of this mess and also divvy up the recovered specimens and try and send them back to the institutions they were stolen from. But as we heard before, it's really hard to do when all the labels have been changed. And the man who's most frustrated by all of this has got to be one Dr. Athol Waterhouse, who, partly because of his poor health, had just been cut out of the loop and reads about this happening in the Sydney Morning Herald and is pretty annoyed, shall we say. But of course, all the present-day museum staff, they're annoyed with him because he could have stopped this all. He could have warned them, and now he's second-guessing their work, trying to put it back to rights. And once they've finished, I think they're in Adelaide for something like 9 days, almost a fortnight, they decide they've done the best they can with it. They leave it to Waterhouse to go back to Sydney and keep sort of sifting through things, but ultimately it's too big a job. And in 1950, Gustavus Athol Waterhouse dies. And his old friend George Lyell dies as well, not long afterwards. And so, with an eye to that longer lifespan of a museum collection, knowing that these guys, their successors, years down the track might need to refer back to these specimens, they do what an entomologist is prone to do. They make more labels. They print out thousands of yellow labels that they pin to each recovered specimen that says passed through the C.W. Wyatt theft collection, 1946 to 1947, and it's basically a big warning that says, look, we're not really sure about any of these. And when you talk to the present-day entomologists at the museum next door, whenever they encounter, when a student comes to do their PhD about this some particular species, and they want to go back and look at the holotype, and when they pull up that holotype and perhaps it's got a little yellow label peeking out from under it, they know they're in for a world of pain. And it is pretty incredible. So I took this photo at the Australian Museum, and you can just see these little yellow labels peeking out right throughout. And it is bitterly ironic, but also kind of poignant that Colin Wyatt's name is now commemorated forever in all these museum collections, pinned right up alongside the names of Waterhouse, Lyell, and all these other collectors whose prize collections he stole from. Which, just to bring us full circle, is how Dr. Michael Braby eventually tracks down that original flame hair streak, the holotype that Johnny Hobson had found in the snow back in 1922. It turned out it had travelled halfway around the world, was surrendered by Colin Wyatt in January 1947, and came back to Australia with that fake label that claimed Wyatt himself had collected it. Evidently, Waterhouse just wasn't able to. He had a big backlog of stuff to get through. He wasn't able to put that one back to rights before he passed away, and so it sat there for decades and decades and decades, waiting for someone like Michael Braby to pick up the trail, which he indeed did. And as we can see in this photo, he decided he didn't want to just swap the labels back, because that would be kind of erasing its history as well. That was too risky a move for as diligent a scientist as Michael Braby. So he did the only sensible thing. He made some more labels. And so here you have the fake and the original side by side in a neat little box at the Australian Museum in Sydney. And the one on the top is the original, and the bottom one is the fake. And so, yeah, quite a story. And this isn't even the only example. When I was finishing this book, there was another specimen that they located somewhere in a German museum that they figured out it had a label with Wyatt's handwriting, and they concluded that it was very likely another long-lost holotype that had been swapped out from the Melbourne collection and hadn't been surrendered. It had somehow ended up in this German collection. And I found out just before I went to London to research this book that the butterfly hadn't actually been physically repatriated from London back to Melbourne. And so, of course, I volunteered my services. They just needed someone to ferry it in their hand luggage. And I said, guys, I'm doing it anyway. And the kind folk at the Melbourne Museum were very polite, but also very quick to say, no, we've got professional scientists for that. And it would have made, I tell you, an incredible ending for my book. But it wasn't to be. And to be fair, if there is one moral to this story, it's don't give precious butterflies to smooth-talking dudes who swan in off the street. But why is this story so compelling? There's a lot of things. Colin Wyatt himself is just this fascinating character. It's like he's walked out of a Graham Greene novel in so many ways. But for me, it really comes back to, and this is what initially sparked my interest when I heard about that story, just those few basic details when I was working at the museum all those months ago. Because when we talk about museum collections, about heists and thefts, we can understand that, as I said, like the Mona Lisa or some great master's painting or gold or jewels. But it's something a bit more esoteric about a museum scientific collection, a whole bunch of butterflies. But as we've seen, each single specimen creates a much bigger picture. And the collectors who piece these collections together, they don't know how these collections will be used in a century's time, what kind of questions scientists will have to go back to consult their collections to answer. You know, in 1922, when Johnny Hobson finds that butterfly in the snow, do you think he's heard of climate change? Things like that? No, but he collects the specimen and it goes into this museum collection. And so 100 years later, if we go back to these museums and find that the collection has holes in it, it's like the Bayeux tapestry has had moths get into it. There's really no way to get that knowledge back. And the case for me, it highlights as well that in so many ways, these museum systems, they're built on these quite utopian ideals, that greater collective, body of knowledge and understanding. But in so many ways, they are, just that. They're a human ideal that often fails in execution. The case, I think, was extremely exposing to museums because if the museums aren't looking after their collections, it does in many ways undermine their fundamental purpose as this sort of safe and secure repository for all scientific and cultural knowledge. And if that didn't stack up, if they didn't stack up to that mission, was everything they did to build those collections worth it? And so the book, I tell this story that I've just told you, but I also tell a lot of other stories about the history of museums and museum collections and natural history in Australia, from Joseph Banks collecting butterflies on that first trip on the Endeavour, right up to the present day. And I was surprised when I was putting this paper trail, when I was following this paper trail, I was at the Melbourne Museum in their archives, and this, along with the funny little notes about cultured accents, I was also finding in between these letters about butterflies, just the general sort of business as usual collecting of Aboriginal ancestors and other really important cultural objects that today are causing all kinds of headaches and really traumatic legacies for First Nations communities and communities all around the world, and museum staff as well. There was something poignant that the same museum professionals who were so frustrated that Colin Wyatt, the man they trusted, had come in and taken everything and run away with it. They were participating in a lot of these acts that maybe today we would regard as a kind of theft. And when I think about that image of looking at these drawers of butterflies and seeing these little yellow labels that tell a different, more complicated story, more circuitous story, it made me think, what would happen if you went into a museum, a gallery floor, and what if you just saw these little yellow labels peeking out from all the other objects that are on display? What if they told a different story to the one on the plaque? What if these objects were also part of a theft collection? And the fact that Colin Wyatt was able to talk his way into these places, arouse no suspicion, and get caught up, and even get caught in the act, it tells us something about the values these places were built on, because they were created by generations of collectors who looked and sounded an awful lot like Colin Wyatt. The fact he fit right in and then robbed them blind says a lot about the museums themselves. So, what does happen to our friend Colin Wyatt? Well, he slips out the courtroom from a side door to avoid the press. It's very nice of the court officials to let him do that. And then he immediately goes to Europe. He goes on another ski holiday. But he later re-emerges in the 1950s and he writes this book, The Call of the Mountains, and he follows it up with his second book, Going Wild, the autobiography of a bug hunter. And into this story, he puts into print his life, his adventures, all these butterflies that he's caught. And in many ways, it echoes the beats of what his lawyer laid out on that day in the courtroom in West Ham. But it's not a sad story of a sickly little boy, an aloof, lonely child. It's this boy's own coming-of-age adventure. It's recast in a totally different light. But just as he was in life, on the page, Colin is not a reliable narrator. And wouldn't you know, he doesn't mention these thefts at all in his adventures of a bug hunter. His Australian chapter simply ends with, anyway, I decided to go back to England, and then the travel bug got me again, and I was off to Morocco. He is trying to whitewash his own history, just like that golden age of adventure and exploration he was raised on. Rarely acknowledged the cost. And as for Colin, he later also reinvented himself as a photographer and a journalist, and even became a Buddhist at one point in the 1950s. He meets the Dalai Lama, which is a very exciting episode. And then by 1975, he's gone through another metamorphosis. He's become an amateur archaeologist. And he is learning all about Mayan civilizations in Guatemala. And in November 1975, he boards a plane to an area of jungle that he's heard might have some kind of hitherto undiscovered ruin, buried in the jungle. A new discovery that's just waiting for someone like him to come and uncover. So he changes his itinerary, he gets himself a seat on this once-a-week plane trip, but the weather is bad, and not long after takeoff, the plane crashes. And at 66 years old, Colin Wyatt's life of adventure is finally over. His butterfly collection, back at his mother's old house, I should say this is his legitimate collection, the one that he's been collecting since he was a boy, and in most instances we can say he did in fact collect them himself, and collected them from some pretty far-flung remote locations because he did lead this extraordinary adventurous life, collecting butterflies in far more remote places than any other entomologist went. Those butterflies end up in a museum. Thanks, everyone. I'll finish with a quote. This is a great passage from Going Wild, his second book. A collection is not a mere dry as dust assortment of scientific specimens. I enjoy looking through my collection for the sheer beauty of the butterflies alone, but greatest, I think, is the pleasure one gets on a dull winter's day, recalling some sunny spot in a far-off land, the warmth of the air, the scent of the flowers, adventures with strange peoples, and all the incidents of the day a particular specimen was caught, which is a very eloquent way of describing his approach to butterfly collecting, but, as we've established, a very unreliable one. Thank you all for coming on this very soggy day. Joe from Dimmicks has trundled through the rain with a whole bunch of books. Both books I will happily sign, deface any copies you like to buy. I'll happily not do that as well if you just want to get out of here. But please go pay a visit to Joe on your way out. And thank you to Patrick and everyone for having me. This is Colin as well, in Canada in 1952. This is almost a decade after those thefts, and people are still letting him touch butterflies.